I don't look at paper maps anymore. If I can help it, I don't look at fields either. Especially when the corn dries out in October and the stalks turn that pale bone color. My name is Phoebe. I'm 25 and, until last month, I was a junior geospatial analyst for a subcontractor that works for the Department of the Interior. Basically, I made maps. Most of the work is digital now, cleaning up satellite telemetry, correcting zoning lines for flood insurance, that sort of boring administrative stuff. It's good work. Or it was. 3 weeks ago, my supervisor, a man named Derek whose only personality trait is drinking stale coffee, called me over to his desk. He had a quadrant up on his monitor. It was a section of rural Appalachia, tucked away in a valley that technically shouldn't exist based on the elevation models we use. Data corruption, Derek mumbled, tapping the screen with a pen cap. The satellite sweep from 09-14 and last week all showing the same thing. A blur. Just pixels. Like someone took an eraser to the raw image data. I looked closer. It was a rectangular patch of gray in the middle of a sea of deep forest green. Maybe cloud cover? Reflection anomaly? For 3 separate flyovers over 10 years? Derek shook his head. The county records say it's BLM land, but an old deed says it's private agricultural. We can't publish the updated regional topos with a hole in the middle. I need you to drive out there. Take the LiDAR drone. Take the handheld GPS. Get me ground truth. Prove it exists. I was actually excited. Field work was rare. I packed my gear into one of the agency jeeps, loaded up a cooler with sandwiches and energy drinks, and started the 4-hour drive into the mountains. The spot was deep in the backcountry. I eventually had to leave the jeep at the end of a logging trail that looked like it hadn't seen a tire since the Reagan administration. The GPS on my dashboard had already given up, displaying a questioning circle. So I grabbed the heavy-duty Garmin handheld, my backpack, and the case for the mapping drone. It was a 40-minute hike through dense scrub brush and pine before the tree line abruptly stopped. It didn't taper off. It stopped dead, like a wall. I stepped out of the cool shade of the forest and into the valley. This was the black spot on the map. The valley was bowl-shaped, surrounded on all sides by high, steep ridges that probably messed with radio signals. The sky above was a flat, heavy sheet of gray stratus clouds, diffusing light so there are almost no shadows. It was farmland, but it was wrong. The soil was churned and dark, tilled into perfect rows that stretched for acres. But nothing was growing. No corn, no wheat, no soybeans. Just acres and acres of dark dirt and patches of yellow, dying witchgrass. And the silence. That was the first thing that hit my chest, a physical pressure. In the woods behind me, there had been cicadas, squirrels, the rustle of deer. Here, silence. Total vacuum-sealed silence. I checked my equipment. The drone compass was spinning lazily, unable to find north. The GPS screen just read, calculating, indefinitely. Great, I muttered. The sound of my own voice was shockingly loud. I started walking down the center path between the tilled rows, intending to set up the drone in the geographic center of the valley. That's when I saw the first one. About 50 yards out, standing on a crooked wooden post, was a scarecrow. It was fairly standard at first glance. Blue flannel shirt, faded denim overalls, a burlap sack for a head stuffed with straw. It faced away from me, looking towards the center of the valley. As I walked past it, I felt a shiver crawl up my neck. I'm not a superstitious person. I'm a scientist. But the proportions were unsettling. The arms weren't just sticks. They were padded out to look muscular. The hands weren't loose straw. They were white gardening gloves, stitched tight, fingers curled as if gripping something invisible. I kept walking. 100 yards further, I found two more. They were smaller, child-sized. They were positioned differently. They weren't up on posts. They were on the ground. One, dressed in a little pink dress stained brown by the elements, was seated on the dirt. The other, wearing a boy striped polo shirt, was kneeling opposite her. I stopped. I took out my binoculars and focused on them. Between them, resting in the dirt, was a tea set. It was real porcelain, cracked and filthy. "Who does this?" I whispered. It looked like an art installation. A really morbid, middle-of-nowhere art project. I pressed on deeper into the valley. The topography was flat, making it easy to see the layout as I moved further in. And as I walked, the dread in my gut turned into cold, heavy lead. It wasn't just a few scarecrows. The fields were full of them. There were hundreds. And they weren't guarding crops. They were the crop. Or rather, they were the population. I reached what looked like the town square of this bizarre display. In a wide clearing of dead grass, someone had dragged out furniture. Old, rotting velvet armchairs, dining room tables, school desks, park benches. And the scarecrows were everywhere, enacting a silent, motionless pantomime of life. To my left, a family of 4 sat around a dinner table. The father figure had a burlap face painted with a crude, wide, black smile. He wore a suit that was rotting off his straw frame. The mother wore pearls, plastic, cheap pearls, and her painted mouth was a surprised, "Oh." They had empty plates in front of them. To my right, rows of school desks held smaller figures. They faced a larger scarecrow at the front who had a ruler taped to its glove. I should have turned back. Every instinct in my primate brain was screaming at me that this was predator territory. "Run, Phoebe! Run back to the car!" But I had a job, and I had a camera. I pulled out my DSLR and started snapping photos. Documentation. Derek wouldn't believe this without proof. The sheer effort required to haul this furniture out here, to stitch these hundreds of dolls. It was insanity. I moved through the park scene. Scarecrows frozen on rusted swing sets. A scarecrow walking a dog made of hay and wire. It was then that I noticed the wind. The valley had been breezy when I arrived, a constant, low draft sweeping down from the mountains. It rustled the dry grass and made the hundreds of flannel shirts and burlap sacks flap and snap. Wish, snap, wish, snap. It was the only sound in the world. Then, it stopped. The wind just died. The stillness that followed was absolute. It was as if the world had held its breath. I stood in front of a park bench, about 5 feet away from a scarecrow dressed like an old man, complete with a flap cap and a cane. I lowered my camera to check the light exposure on the screen. I frowned at the reading. It took me maybe 2 seconds. I blinked, rubbing the grit from my eye, and looked back up at the old man. He was looking at me. I froze. Before, his head had been tilted down, chin resting on his chest, looking at the ground. Now, the burlap's face was tilted up. The black painted eyes, just erratic swirls of tar or paint, were fixed directly on my face. "Okay," I said, my voice shaking. "Wind moved you. Obviously." But there was no wind. The air was stagnant and dead. I took a step back. "It's just gravity," I reasoned aloud. The stuffing shifted. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I needed to leave. Right now. I didn't care about the drone data. I turned around to head back toward the tree line. I looked at the schoolroom setup. All 20 of the children scarecrows were now standing. My blood went cold. I swear my heart stopped beating for a full 3 seconds. A moment ago, they had been seated at the desks. Now they were standing, their stick legs awkwardly braced against the metal chair legs. And every single painted face was turned toward me. I didn't move. I couldn't breathe. I stared at them, eyes wide, burning. Nothing happened. They stood there, inanimate. Bundles of hay and cloth. "Don't blink," a voice in my head whispered. "Don't you dare blink." I backed up, slowly. My boot heel caught on a tuft of root, and I flinched, my eyes shutting for a fraction of a second in panic. A sound dry as autumn leaves rubbing together. I snapped my eyes open. They were out from behind the desks. All of them. They had advanced maybe 3 feet. Their poses were stiff, jerky, like bad stop-motion animation frozen in time. One of them, a figure in a red sweater, was reaching out a gloved hand. It wasn't a prank. There was nobody pulling wires. I was surrounded by acres of open ground. The wind picked up suddenly, a strong gust that blew hair across my face. I gasped, waiting for them to rush me. But they didn't. As the wind blew, shaking their clothes and rattling their wooden spines, they remained completely still. They looked like inanimate objects again. The life had drained out of them with the return of the air currents. I understood the rules. I didn't know how or why, but I understood the logic. Wind is safety. No wind and eyes open, standoff. No wind and eyes closed, they move. I scrambled backward, turning to run while the wind was blowing. I sprinted past the dinner party family. Their heads bobbed in the breeze, lifeless and limp. I made it maybe 50 yards before the wind died again. I skid to a halt, spinning around, terrified to leave my back exposed in the silence. Silence. Total silence. I stood there, panting, sweat stinging my eyes. I stared at the dinner party. They were 50 feet away. The father, mother, and 2 children. My eyes were watering. I needed to blink. "Come on," I whimpered, begging the sky. "Blow." Nothing. One tear leaked out. The burning was unbearable. I winked my left eye, keeping the right open. Nothing moved. Okay, I can cheat. I swapped eyes, winking the right one. The father scarecrow shifted. It wasn't a run. It was a glitch. One frame, he was at the head of the table. I winked. Now he was standing on top of the table, towering high, his arms spread wide like a hawk descending. I screamed. I couldn't help it. I blinked with both eyes in sheer reflex. I opened my eyes. He was right in front of me. He was huge. Up close, the smell was overwhelming. Rotting wet straw, moldy fabric, and something else underneath. Something like copper and dried meat. His burlap face was inches from mine. The painted smile was cracked where the fabric had folded. I stared into the painted swirls of his eyes. I couldn't look away. I locked my muscles, forcing my eyelids to stay up. He was frozen in mid-reach, his white gardening gloves hovering near my throat. I could see the individual fibers of the burlap. I could see the stains on the fabric that looked suspiciously dark. The other scarecrows were moving in the periphery. I could feel them. Whenever I focused too hard on the father, the edges of my vision blurred, and the others, the school children, the swing set watchers, encroached. I needed wind. Please, I whispered through clenched teeth. My eyes felt like they were filled with sand. My vision was swimming. The silence stretched on. It felt like minutes. It was probably only seconds. The father's painted mouth seemed to be stretching. I knew it wasn't possible. It was paint on cloth. But the weave of the burlap was pulling apart, hole by hole, widening that black void. I couldn't hold it. I dropped to the ground. It was instinct. The second my eyes closed, I threw myself flat onto the dirt and rolled. I heard the swish of something heavy swinging through the space where my head had just been. It sounded like a baseball bat hitting a heavy bag. I scrambled up, eyes snapping open. The father was twisted around, his waist contorted unnatural 180 degrees, looking down at where I had been. His gloved hand was buried up to the wrist in the soil. I ran. I didn't look back. I knew the wind was still dead. I knew that because I couldn't hear it in my ears, which meant every time I blinked, they were gaining. I tried to time it. Run, 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 blink. They were getting louder. It wasn't just one or two. It sounded like a stampede of dried husks. Run, 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 blink. I could hear the fabric rubbing against fabric, a dry, rasping, screeching sound. I saw the tree line ahead, the safety of the forest, the boundary. I didn't know if they could leave the field, but I had to pray they couldn't. The scarecrows were rooted to this town, surely. I was 20 yards from the trees. The wind was still gone. My lungs were burning, crying out for oxygen, but my eyes were worse. I had tears streaming down my face, blurring my vision into a watery smear. I tripped. My boot caught in a hidden rut in the dirt. I went down hard, slamming my chest into the earth. The impact knocked the wind out of me. My eyes slammed shut in pain. I didn't open them immediately. I lay there, gasping, trying to suck in air. And I felt them. I felt the sun block out. I felt them standing over me. I heard the creaking of wood straining against fabric. I smelled the rot. It was suffocating. I waited to die. I waited for those white gardening gloves to close around my neck, or for a wooden stake to be driven through my back. But then, I felt a cool touch on my cheek. It was a breeze. The leaves in the forest ahead rustled. The high grass hissed. The wind was back. I scrambled to my hands and knees, coughing, and looked up. They were all there. A semicircle of nightmare figures standing over me. The father was in the center, his hand extended inches from my hair. The teacher from the school was there, holding his ruler like a dagger. The little girl in the pink dress was standing by my leg. But they were swaying. The wind was pushing against them, and they were just dolls. Floppy, lifeless dolls responding to physics. The malice was gone, replaced by the mindless motion of the breeze. I crawled. I didn't stand up. I just scrambled on all fours until I hit the underbrush of the forest. I clawed my way into the pines, scraping my hands on bark and needles, until I was well past the tree line. Only then did I stand up and look back. They were still there at the edge of the field. They hadn't crossed the line where the grass turned to pine needles. They stood in a jagged row, swaying gently. As I watched, the wind began to die down again. The swaying slowed. I didn't wait to see if they would move. I turned and sprinted the 40 minutes back to the Jeep, moving faster than I ever have in my life. I locked the doors, threw the garment into the passenger seat, and peeled out of that logging road so fast I almost wrapped the vehicle around the trunk. I didn't sleep for 3 days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that burlap face. The father. When I got back to the office, I told Derek I found nothing. I told him the logging road was washed out and I couldn't reach the coordinates. I gave him the memory card from the drone, but I had wiped it with a strong magnet I kept in my toolkit first. I told him it malfunctioned. I quit the next day. I told them it was family issues. I've been living in the city since then. Somewhere with streetlights. Somewhere with constant noise. Traffic. People. Movement. But I'm recording this because I checked Google Earth this morning. I don't know why. Morbid curiosity. Maybe. The glitch is gone. The pixelated blur over the valley has been updated with a new, high-res image. You can see the field. You can see the rows of tilled, dead earth. But looking at the satellite image, zoomed all the way in, the arrangement is different. The furniture is gone. The dinner tables, the school desks, the park benches. They've been moved. They're arranged in a new pattern now. A pattern that spirals outward from the center of the valley. They're forming a line. A procession. And the line is heading into the woods, towards the logging road. They aren't residents anymore. They're migrating. And this morning, looking out of my 4th-story apartment window, the streets were quiet. The birds weren't singing. And the wind stopped blowing. If you see one, if you see a scarecrow where it shouldn't be, or a pile of old clothes in the corner of your room that looks a little too full, don't blink. God help you. Don't blink.